Hey, I'm Tim Barton from WallBuilders.
And I'm Jonathan.
And we're here in the Capernaum Studios on set for the Apocalypse Experience, which we definitely encourage you to come check out with your family. Come see some of what's going on. Will be a great experience for you. You definitely want to do it. We want to talk to you real quick, though, about some of what we are hearing in modern culture related to American history. There was a project that came out just in the last several months.
Yeah, it was actually done by this, really well reputable historical organization, right? Called what is it called? The New York Times.
Wait a second. So not a historical organization.
Yeah,
more
newspaper.
Of like newspaper, news magazine.
Yeah. So a whole bunch of journalists got together and they really wanted to give a different story about the beginning of America and where that begins. And instead of starting in 1776, with the Declaration of Independence, the really creation of American institutions, they say, oh no, it's not 1776. It's actually 1619, and that's where America begins.
Yeah, and it's interesting of all the days we could pick, right? You could go back to 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. You could look at some of the early colonies, which happened before 1619, right? And even Jamestown was founded before 1619. But in 1619, what was significant is this is when the first shipload of slaves arrived in America. Now, let me back up to the New York Times real quick, because one of the things that happened is when they were writing all of these different articles, they did hire some professors to come and people that were actually in history, and this is what they studied, this is what they do, and these different historical academic individuals came in and they reviewed the information and they said, okay guys, there's a lot of really bad information in some of what you're writing here, and they offered some critiques, and that was turned down by the New York Times. And the primary editor said, we're not really interested in it being accurate as much as we are in changing the narrative of what is happening in culture today. And so it's worth noting that even people who are not necessarily Christian or conservative historians, even they acknowledge this is not historically accurate, but the people at New York Times said we're more interested in changing the narrative. And so part of what they want to do to change the narrative is in 1619, this was when the first shipload of slaves arrived in America. And I say that a little loosely because, as is historically very evident, slavery existed long before 1619. Even in America, it existed long before 1619. When you look at the native tribes living in America, native tribes frequently would attack other native tribes, enslave other native tribes. There's a lot of history of slavery throughout the world, but in 1619 was the first shipload of African slaves that arrived in America. What's also worth noting is this shipload of African slaves was not initially intending to go to Jamestown.
That's right, Tim. This is actually a Dutch slave ship that was captured by a British ship and then taken to the port of Jamestown, which was founded kind of as the first successful English colony in the New World in 1607. So this is, several years after that, they land there. And what's fascinating is even though they were captured by the Dutch to be slaves, when they arrive in Virginia, they aren't exactly how we would think of as kind of perpetual chattel slavery. In fact, it's something called indentured servitude, right?
And the reason is slavery didn't exist in the sense of it wasn't legal under the king in Jamestown at that time. What was legal was indentured servitude. And indentured servitude meant that you worked for 7 years. At the end of 7 years, you would be given freedom, and then you were given your own property, which is worth noting. A lot of people that came to Jamestown early on didn't have the money to sail across the ocean, so they would find a sponsor. And the sponsor would pay for them to go, and they would say, okay, after we get there, I'll work for you for 7 years to pay off this indentured, essentially a loan that you gave me. And then they would be given freedom. They were given land. They were landowners who then could live their life as they wanted to. Well, these slaves, roughly 19 of them that were on this slave ship that arrives in Jamestown, they're made indentured servants, which, first of all, I'll point out, arriving in Jamestown was one of the best places they could have land given the conditions of what they would have faced going other places. They get to Jamestown, they're made indentured servants. Now, I'm not suggesting that even being an indentured servant would be a fun or a desirable life necessarily, although again, if you look at some of the other conditions of where they could have gone and what could have happened, this would be a much better scenario. But at the end of 7 years, they are given their freedom, they become landowners, and it's estimated that one of those individuals who had initially been one of these indentured servants was one of the guys who actually becomes the first legal slave owner in America.
Yeah, his name is Anthony Johnson. So he's on this first voyage to America. He serves his term as an indentured servant, and then, like you said, he is freed. He is actually given a plot of land. He becomes a landowner, and he actually becomes a owner of indentured servants as well. But what's fascinating is one of his indentured servants, he feels like he's really not getting enough work out of them, and in fact, this servant actually kind of runs away, breaks indentured, and so Anthony Johnson, this African-American man who has been brought over to America and now a landowner, he actually sues his indentured servant in court, and at the end of the court, he actually is able to get a judgment in his favor where this man who was an indentured servant is now made a slave for life. And this is the first recorded instance of chattel slavery where it's not a punishment for a crime or you've been captured in war. And it's actually a black man who becomes kind of this first legal slave owner in America, who himself was on that ship in 1619.
Right. And this is not a defense or accusation about anything historically. This is an acknowledgement more of what happened, which is very different than what the New York Times 1619 Project argued and articulates. In fact, there's many things through there that are very illogical. They argue that actually America was a large proponent of slavery and a large active participant in slavery. And that's just historically not very accurate. It's not true. And if we're going to talk about slavery in America, there's several things that are worth noting. First of all, when you look back to the founding era, so we would argue America actually begins in 1776 when we separate from Great Britain and we become our own nation, our own colony. That's when America actually begins, because before that we're British. So we're not America yet. We are British citizens and British colonies. But in 1776, the Declaration, we separate from Great Britain. And it's fascinating that if you go back to that time, when we separate from Great Britain, even back in the founding era, there were a lot of states who were already going, we don't like slavery and we want to end slavery in our states. And at the end of the Declaration, many states then began actively working to end slavery in their states. And it wasn't very long after that every single state in the northern colonies, the New England colonies, had actually passed laws against slavery.
Yeah, by 1804, every single state in New England, and then also states like New York and New Jersey, had passed laws either for the immediate abolition of slavery or for the gradual abolition of slavery. And what's fascinating is these efforts to end slavery even begin as soon as the signing, like almost before the ink has dried on the Declaration of Independence. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson had included an anti-slavery clause in the original draft of the Declaration. It didn't make it into the final one, but that just goes to show that even people like Thomas Jefferson were already moving in that direction. And so you actually get slavery completely abolished in Massachusetts by 1783, which is before any other nation in the history of the world. And so the northern states in America, by the end of the Revolutionary War, by kind of the first years underneath the Constitution, have effected the largest voluntary emancipation of slaves than anywhere else in the history of the world. They're the first people to do it. This is over 30 years before England abolishes slavery. This is even before, England abolishes the slave trade in America. In those northern colonies, now states, are the first people to do it in the history of the world.
Right. And you mentioned Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration writing this anti-slavery grievance, and it's one of the longest ones. If you go, I'd encourage you to go back and read his original draft of the Declaration and look for that anti-slavery grievance. It's really strong what he says against slavery. Well, then, maybe even providentially, Thomas Jefferson becomes the president to sign the very first anti-slavery or slave trade, specifically anti-slave trade law in the history of the world. We in America were the first nation to sign a law banning the slave trade. It was signed March 2nd, 1807 by Thomas Jefferson. Went into effect January 1st, 1808. So America is the first nation in the history of the world to ban the slave trade. Well, when America finally ends up banning slavery, it was 1865. It's after the 13th Amendment is finally passed. And at this point, England's already ended slavery in 1833, and then Denmark ended it, and then France did. And America was the fourth nation in the history of the world to end slavery. But what's significant is there was 124 nations in the world at that time. America was the fourth of 124 nations to end slavery, and America ended slavery at the end of the Civil War, which, if you remember Civil War history, was one of the bloodiest encounters and battles, like arguably world history, because of how many people died in this. More than 600,000 people died in the Civil War, and largely the issue being fought over in the Civil War was the issue of slavery. So if you look at American history, what you see is that America started before any other nation opposing slavery. America was the first nation to ban the slave trade. America was the fourth nation in the history of the world to end slavery, and America paid a higher price than every other nation in the world ending slavery. And what's even boggling for most people today is they don't realize that slavery still exists today. This year, there was 193 member nations that were part of the United Nations. In 94 of those nations, they've still not passed laws to criminalize or ban slavery in those nations, which is why slavery does still exist. and it's estimated there's more than 40 million people enslaved today.
More than any other time in the history of the world. What's fascinating to me is even in Africa, there's 9.2 million people in slavery today, right now in Africa, which is almost equal to the entire number of slaves brought out of Africa during the transatlantic slave trade over 350 years. And that's happening right now today. But what's fascinating too is that with all of this kind of resurgence of modern slavery, America is on the forefront. It's one of the top 2 nations in the world in fighting against slavery, both at home and abroad. And I mean, through charitable organizations, I mean, America is doing more than almost any other nation right now to end it. And that's just another step in their history of being the first nation, of being the one who gave the most and went through the most effort to abolish slavery in our own history. We're continuing that legacy, and that's not at all the narrative that the 1619 Project has tried to kind of create.
Yeah, and that's not to excuse the fact that America did participate in something that was very evil. That's not to excuse the fact that America has done very bad, sinful, even, and wicked things in our past, in our history. That's part of our story. That's absolutely true. But one of the things that is always worth noting, when you study history, you always want to study in the context of the time in which people live. It's true that America participated in the African slave trade, although we were not one of the leaders of the African slave trade. It's true that we had slavery in America, but I would argue if you look back in the founding era, every nation in the history of the world had slavery, and in the founding era, every nation at that time had slavery at that time. So this was the norm for the world, which means that makes America, being one of the special nations, to be one of the first nations to oppose slavery. And this is where historically, as we look back, a lot of times people want to point to the imperfections of America and point to the fact that America has done so many bad and wicked and evil things. But one of the things I would point out is you name any atrocity you want to in American history, and I will identify how those atrocities came to an end was because God raised up pastors and churches and Christians. Every time without exception. How did those things stop in America? Because of Christians getting involved. You think about even slavery we've been talking about. Who were the early abolitionists? Almost without exception, they were the Christians. They were the churches. They were the pastors saying, we have to put a stop to this in America. And this, again, is where America has been so unique and different. It's not that America hasn't messed up. It's not that America is perfect, because just like everybody in the history of the world, we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That's true for nations as well as individuals. America's not perfect, but every time there was bad, evil, sin, wickedness in our nation, Christians raised up and helped put a stop to it. And this is why, even as we look at culture today, and we see the issues in culture today, this is why it's more important than ever for us as Christians to wake up and go, okay, where do we see ungodliness in culture? Where is there an attack against righteousness? Where is there an attack against the Bible? And where is there injustice happening? As Christians, we want to stand up and not be led by emotions, but be led by what the Bible teaches. What does the Word of God say? And this is where in the history of America, we're not a perfect nation now. Very different than what the 1619 Project says. We're not guilty of most of the crimes they're accusing America of, because even as the chief editor acknowledged, they're not trying to be historically accurate in their accusations. They're trying to change the narrative of the conversation. Well, they've certainly changed the narrative in the conversation, but I want to encourage you as a Christian, we want to always be led and motivated by what is true. The Apostle Paul wrote in Philippians 4:8, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, think on these things. We want to make sure that we are being led by what is true. That means we're being led by what the Bible says. And when we find truth, we want to stand up and defend truth.